بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وبه نستعين ونصلي ونسلم على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما يا رب العالمين. Now, so moving on, we were mentioning that inshallah ta'ala in today's lesson we're going to be going through a little bit regarding the work itself, which is the Usul of al-Imam al-Shashi rahimahullah ta'ala. And we said that لم يوضح المؤلف اسمه ولا شيئا عن نفسه في هذا الكتاب ومع ذلك فقد لقي الكتاب قبولا واسعا ثم العلماء اختلفوا في تعيين المؤلف على أربعة أقوال. That the author did not himself clarify anything regarding himself when it comes to this book. And even though the author did not tell us who he was, still the work was accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it's accepted in the different seminaries across the centuries and in the Hanafi institutions in an immense way. And usually that's not the case. Usually what happens is that there is an author who becomes famous by way of his works. So how is an alim recognized? An alim is recognized by a few things. Number one, who are his teachers? Number two, who are his students? And number three, what are the works that he actually compiled and produced? So you can call it a'mal ilmiya. Now they don't have to always be actual written works. For example, it could be simply imla'at that students gather later on. But the point is that we have some sort of access to his ilm. So a little bit of window towards his ilm, and through that the alim becomes famous. And once an alim becomes famous, then any work that he's compiled, because ilm is something that speaks for itself. So any work that he compiles after that, that work will be considered such that people will take it with consideration and they will study it and so on and so forth. However, very rarely does this happen where we don't know exactly who the author is to begin with. And yet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala granted it so much acceptance. There's a few works that this has happened with, and from them is the Usul of al-Imam al-Shashi rahimahullah ta'ala. Who exactly is this Shashi? La na'rif. Yani the scholars differed doing ta'een of who exactly he was, but in reality, he didn't himself clarify as to who he is. Like, when it comes to who he was, there's four opinions that are normally mentioned. Number one, Abu Yaqub Ishaq ibn Ibrahim al-Shashi. And I want you to look at the dates that they passed away specifically. Abu Yaqub Ishaq ibn Ibrahim al-Shashi passed away in the year 325 after Hijrah. And another opinion is Abu Ali Ahmad ibn Muhammad al-Shashi, who passed away in the year 344 after Hijrah. He was one of the students of Abu al-Hasan al-Karhi. Like, these two opinions, the first and second opinion, we say these two opinions are ba'id, difficult opinions. We don't consider them to be strong opinions. Why? Because if you look at the dates that they passed away, 325 and 344, that doesn't correspond with a few different things. Number one, al-Imam al-Shashi rahimahullah ta'ala, in this work, he actually gives ishara towards Ibn al-Sabbagh al-Shafi'i in the work. And he passed away in the year 477. In fact, in the work as well, he does naqal from Qadi Abu Zayd. Like, literally he says, Qadi al-Qadi. And he passed away in the year 430. So how can the author of the work be before the individuals, in fact, in some of these instances, over a century before the individuals that he is actually doing naqal of? So that is impossible. Then on top of that, if you remember, we mentioned in the last lesson that the taqsim of the tarbi' that exists in our books, where you have the 4x4. So in the Usul of the Hanafiya, you have looking at Kitabullah from four different perspectives, and in each four of them there are four categories. This taqsim, who was the one who introduced this taqsim? He was Abu Zayd al-Dabusi in his work Taqweem al-Adillah. And al-Shashi rahimahullah ta'ala, the author of Usul al-Shāshī, in this work he actually goes based on this taqsim as well. So there's a number of things regarding this work that tell us that it's very unlikely that the authors were in the 4th century, meaning the 300s. And normally when you look at all of the works that are compiled, so this is one of the methods of determining and deciphering and decoding and figuring out who the actual author is. If you just look at the way the work is compiled, so in the 4th century, in the 300s, the way this work has been compiled, you're going to find that it's not exactly the same as the way it was compiled. The way it was compiled amongst, or the way normal works used to be compiled in that time. So if you look at, for example, al-Fusul lil-Jassas al-Razi, you look at, for example, that is a Hanafi work that we have. We look at the Hanafi big books compiled in fiqh as well. And then you look at the Usul of al-Karhi as well, rahimahullah ta'ala, we find that it's not actually the similar type of compilation. It's a very different type of compilation that seems more likely that it was in a later time and not in the 4th century. So these two opinions, we say these are very difficult. The third opinion is Badruddin al-Shashi al-Shirwani. He was alive around 752/852, so in the 8th and 9th century. And then you have Nizamuddin al-Shashi from the scholars of the 7th century. And this is, the last opinion is the one that is normally adopted and considered to be the strongest opinion regarding who is the author of Uṣūl al-Shāshī. So what is the manhaj of the author in this work? This is very important. Whenever you study a work, whenever you study a book, it's important to study the book based on, now keep this in mind, this is for every single work that you study, but specifically usul and but in general, every single book that you study in every subject, not just usul al-fiqh. You want to study the work based on the methodology and what the author was considering when he compiled the work. So the methodology of the author and what he was considering and how he compiled the work. This is really important. You don't approach the work as you feel like approaching the work. You approach the work as is in line with what the author was thinking or what the author was trying to achieve by way of compiling that work. For example, Imam Abu Dawud al-Sijistani, he has his famous Sunan. He wrote a risala to the people of Mecca, explaining to him what he was trying to achieve with that Sunan, what he was compiling and what type of hadith he brought and so on and so forth. So now when you study the book, you have to study his risala first. Why? So that you understand what he's trying to achieve in his work. Because he's telling you what he's trying to achieve in his work. Same thing with Imam Abu Abdullah al-Bukhari rahimahullah ta'ala, Muhammad ibn Ismail al-Bukhari. When he compiled his Sahih, one thing is just study the Sahih and just go through the hadith and have no idea. But one thing is to first go through an entire process where you want to study what was Imam al-Bukhari rahimahullah ta'ala trying to achieve by way of this Sahih. And what has he placed in it? What type of ahadith has he brought in it? What conditions is he following? And what is he not doing in his Sahih? So that when you study the work, you're focusing on those aspects specifically, not just reading a hadith for the sake of reading a hadith and explaining them as you please. No, rather you're focusing on what the author was trying to achieve. Same thing with this work, which is the Usul of Imam al-Shashi rahimahullah ta'ala. We want to understand, and how do we determine? So how do we determine what the author is trying to achieve or how he's trying to write his book? The best way to do that is if the author himself left something for us that we can resort to, and by way of that we're able to determine what he was trying to achieve in his work. But over here I said that we don't have that. Unfortunately, we don't have anything written by Imam al-Shashi rahimahullah ta'ala. We don't have anything even regarding the author aslan, let alone have anything regarding what he was trying to achieve in the book. On top of that, he doesn't have a muqaddimah. He goes straight into the book. The muqaddimah is like a few lines, 2-3 lines, and then straight into the book. So he literally just left out all of the, the extra stuff that a lot of times you find in a lot of books. So normally when an author writes a book, he writes a foreword, he writes an introduction, he gives you a little bit of an idea of what led him towards writing the book and so on and so forth. We don't have any of that in this book. So now, how do we determine what his manhaj is? Over here, we apply the same philosophy that the Ahnaf apply in the ilm of Usul al-Fiqh in general, which is reverse engineering. So you go through his work, and then you do talkhis of what you feel like most likely he is doing in his work. Okay, so you go through the entire work, and then you do talkhis. Okay, or you try and understand, and you try and extract and derive what was the author, al-Imam al-Shashi rahimahullah ta'ala, trying to, or how was he compiling this work. So this is the process of determining the manhaj. So, number one, as I've mentioned before, alhamdulillah, I taught his work before. So this is just things that I noticed while I was teaching the work. You can find in Shuruh more detail regarding the exact manhajiyah of the author. Number one, we have لخص من الدبوسي وتأثر بالبزدوي كثيرا. And this is usually the case of any scholar that comes after al-Imam al-Bazdawi rahimahullah ta'ala. As we mentioned in Manar, or we mentioned in the previous lesson, that everyone that came after al-Bazdawi and Sarakhsi, pretty much the umda that they were relying on was al-Bazdawi and Sarakhsi. So likewise, al-Imam al-Shashi rahimahullah ta'ala, number one, we know he's done talkhis, or he's taking things from the usul of al-Dabusi, that's for sure. Why? Because he mentions him explicitly. And on top of that, we know that he's being influenced by Bazdawi as well. The method of presentation that is found in Usul al-Bazdawi, very similar to the method of presentation that is found in Usul al-Shāshī. Although, along with saying that, he does change the order here and there. So it's not the exact order. Okay, and this becomes important when you try and understand, okay, what was he really trying to achieve in the actual work? We'll elaborate this on. We'll elaborate on this, inshallah, slightly. Number 2, this is a really important point. الكتاب مختصر فترك المصنف كثيرا من المباحث روما للاختصار. طيب, this work is a مختصر. What does a مختصر mean? I want you to take, for example, الهداية للمرغناني as an example. Al-Marghinani rahimahullah ta'ala, anyone who studied Hidayah, or if you study Hidayah, when you study Hidayah, inshallah, you're going to find out that initially he compiled a very large work. In that work was around 80 volumes. Then he felt that, okay, you know what, it's 80 volumes, it's massive, and very unlikely that students are actually going to, go through this 80 volumes. Al-Himam taqsur, yani people it's becoming difficult for students to access the long works. So let me make it smaller. So he wanted to make a mukhtasar of his sharh, this long sharh that he compiled. And again, the matan he chose, as you know, is the matan of al-Quduri and Jami' al-Saghir. Then he writes a sharh on that. The sharh is 80 volumes, very long. He compiles it, or he summarizes all those 80 volumes and makes it very concise. Like when you summarize a large work, one is that you initially compile the work. There's a difference between initially compiling a very small work versus taking a very large work and summarizing it into a very small work. These are two very different things. Keep this in mind. When you compile a work and you're from the very get-go, the idea is that this is going to be a very short primer. Okay. In that situation, your mindset is very different. Versus when you're taking a very large work and then you yourself are taking that work and trying to summarize it in as little words as you possibly can. Like, what will you do when you take a large work and you summarize it in a very small work? Number 1, you have to decide what to keep and what to remove. You have to decide what to keep and what to remove. Because if you mention everything, then it beats the point. Okay, so let's say now, just as an example, guys, let's say there is one mabhath. Okay, in that mabhath, I start off with giving you the tasawwur of the mas'ala. So the first thing I will begin with is the tasawwur of the mas'ala. This is the most important thing. The most important thing. Okay. I want the person to understand the concept first. So if we want to talk about, for example, mutlaq and muqayyad. Let's just take mutlaq and muqayyad as an example. Then we're going to mention examples from Uṣūl al-Shāshī as well. Let's take mutlaq and muqayyad. We want to start off with mutlaq and muqayyad. The first thing that I need to explain is I have to define it. I will define mutlaq and I will define muqayyad. Okay. تعريف المطلق والمقيد. That's number 1. Then after this, after mentioning the ta'rif, I have to pinpoint, because again, our goal is in the mutawalat is comparative usul. So you're comparing it with people that differ with you. So in this situation, the first thing I would have to pinpoint is what is the hukum of mutlaq al-muqayyad, followed by the mahallun niza', and when there is a difference, for example, in this scenario with the Shafi'iyya, where exactly is the difference taking place? So I mentioned the hukum, okay, that this is the way we treat mutlaq, and this is the way we treat muqayyad. And then we mentioned the mahallun niza'. In that, I will also have to mention the suwar, because the mahallun niza' will then correspond with the suwar, the different scenarios of mutlaq and muqayyad. Because mutlaq and muqayyad is not just one scenario. There's multiple different scenarios. And the mahallun niza' it entails those scenarios. In some of those scenarios, there's ittifaq, there is no khilaf. In some of the scenarios, there's khilaf. So I need to pinpoint exactly which scenario where there is khilaf, which scenario there isn't khilaf. Okay. Now, after mentioning that, then I would bring examples. Amthila. Technically, I should be bringing examples of each and every single scenario. So I should bring examples of the first scenario. Let's say there's no ikhtilaf in that, mahallu ittifaq, but bring an example just to show people that this is how it works. The second scenario, third scenario, whatever scenario has where there's actually khilaf between the Hanafi and the Shafi'i, for example, I show through that example that I'm going to bring that this is where the khilaf occurred, so our result will be so-and-so, their result will be so-and-so. X, Y, and Z. I bring these examples and I clarify what the theory that was previously mentioned over here. So the hukum and the ta'rif, and so you start recognizing, or in fact, even before I would get to the hukum, after I mentioned the definition, I would bring examples of mutlaq in general and muqayyad in general, just so that you first have an understanding of how to recognize mutlaq and muqayyad as a student. If I was teaching a student, the first thing I would do before even talking about the scenario where there's khilaf in the hukum and so on and so forth, is that first when I see it, I need to recognize it, because this is at the end of the day, usul is meant to be applied. And we want to prepare students to be able to recognize and apply these qawaid whenever they're able to see it. So the first thing I would do, actually, we missed this point, which is really the most important point, which is right after mentioning the definition, I would bring examples to show you how it takes place, so you're able to recognize it when you see it. Just what word is mutlaq, what word is muqayyad. Just being able to recognize it. طيب, even in mutlaq and muqayyad, there's so many different types of taqeed, so I would bring examples for all of them. Taqeed is not only one way. Taqeed can be, for example, with the sifa, it can be, for example, with jar majur phrase, it can be in a lot of different ways. Like with hal and so on and so forth. So I would show you all these different examples of how taqeed is taking place, and I'll show you examples so that you're able to, and then you would train upon this a little bit so you're able to recognize the examples. Then we would go to the hukum, which is actually the gharad of the usuli. The gharad of the usuli is not showing examples of how mutlaq and muqayyad takes place or how it looks. The gharad of the usuli is ish. What's the hukum? Because he's looking from an usuli perspective. How do we treat it from an usuli perspective? طيب. Then in the hukum we mentioned the mahallu niza'. Over there we mentioned the surah that it comes in. Then we bring examples for each one of them. طيب. Then we also bring contested examples. So we can bring contested examples. Or we can bring examples that were mentioned by some scholars, because this is a mutawwal. Again, this is a very large work. We bring examples that were compiled or presented by certain scholars that we might disagree, the author might disagree with, that this is not actually a good example of this mas'ala aslan, and it doesn't fit well with the concept that we're trying to portray over here. Like, after all of this is finished, then another discussion that I would mention is that mutlaq and muqayyad is very similar to az-ziyada al-nas. Then I would explain what ziyada al-nas means. And then we would bring examples of a ziyada al-nas. So if you were compiling a mukhtasar, you would first number in the mutawwal, you have all of this explained. So you have the tasawwur of the mas'ala. For that you have ta'rif of mutlaq and muqayyad. In that we have examples of different forms of taqeed, different verses where there's mutlaq happening, places where there's muqayyad happening, so linguistically you can recognize it. Then you have the hukum and mahallu niza', the suwar of mutlaq and muqayyad, examples, contested examples. Then we have another mas'ala that stems from that, which is ziyada al-nas, and the examples of a ziyada al-nas. And then you have, after all of this, you can mention ishkarat, so objections. Objections that possibly could be presented against what we mentioned previously, and the Hanafi and so on and so forth. If I am taking a work which mentions all of this and I'm trying to make it mukhtasar, what do I have to do in the process? I have to literally remove half of these things. So if you look at, for example, in Uṣūl al-Shāshī, the actual text of mutlaq and muqayyad, so he removes, number one, in the ta'rif, he doesn't mention, I don't think he mentions the ta'rif of both of them. So remove the ta'rif of one, because once you understand one, you automatically understand the other. So la bas. You understand both. Then, bringing examples of mutlaq and muqayyad so that you are able to, so again, we're going to move muqayyad, we're going to remove the examples as well. Bringing examples of them so that you're able to recognize them when you see them. That's like a nahwi thing. That's like just explaining Arabic. So we don't need to do that. We're just looking at it from an usuli's perspective. That's it. This examples, forget about that. Hopefully the student gets it. Then when it comes to the hukum as well, does it make sense, ahbab? Because what's our gharad, again, is in usul, is to understand how it relates to the Shafi'i madhab and how we differ and so on and so forth. If you were going to bring examples, would you bring in the hukum, would you mention the scenarios where there's ittifaq or mention the scenarios where there's ikhtilaf? The scenarios where there's ikhtilaf, what's the benefit of mentioning the scenarios where there's ittifaq? So let's forget about all the scenarios where there's ittifaq aslan. Let's only mention the scenario which is mukhtalaf fi. So let's not mention all the scenarios. Let's only mention the scenario which is mukhtalaf fi. So in that, I'm not going to bring all the surah. Examples, now over here we have examples of this scenario which is mukhtalaf fi. Then we have contested examples. Then we have another mas'ala which is very similar to it and examples of that mas'ala. I want to make this as concise as possible. So you know what? Let me just get rid of all of this, And what if I just give you examples of az-ziyada ala nas instead? Why? Because they're treated the same way. So az-ziyada ala nas is treated the same way really as mutlaq al-muqayyad. It's the same concept really. So I'm not going to explain to you the concept of ziyada ala nas. Again, I want to make this as mukhtasar as possible. I'll just give you an example, which is really for ziyada ala nas and it's not for mutlaq al-muqayyad. But inshallah, through that example, you realize that, okay, this, take the same concept you understood in mutlaq al-muqayyad, apply it over here as well. And you get the point. And then ishkalat, I'll only mention if there's serious ishkalat, I might mention one or two. And in that too, I'll only give you one basic answer to it and move on. Like, this is how mukhtasarat are. Okay, so what you end up doing in a mukhtasar, and this is the case with every single mukhtasar. Same thing with hidayah. Sahib al-hidayah is doing the same thing. Same thing with all of the mutun. Why are the mutun so, why do we say mafhum mukhalafa is a hujjah in the mutun of fiqh? This is the reason, because every single word that they're selecting, they're only mentioning it for a very specific reason, because they're trying to make it as concise as possible. So over here now, the fiqh, meaning opening up the matan, becomes such an important thing. Because otherwise you're not going to understand what the author is trying to say. So normally, for example, if you were really teaching beginners, you would be like, okay, we're going to mention the arkan, we're going to mention the definition. Okay, in the definition, we're also going to mention the arkan and the shurut and the mawani. And so, like, instead of mentioning all these separately in separate categories and elaborating, I want to put all of this in one line. Everything in one line. How would I do that? So the words that I select are very, very important. Now in the mutun, when they're mentioning definitions, half the time in their definitions they're also mentioning shurut and they're also mentioning other stuff. And now the teacher has to come and open all of it, because the matan is not telling you any of that. And again, it's meant to be a mukhtasar. So when you study mukhtasarat, again, this is actually something that should be studied before you even study any mukhtasar. In fact, before you study Nur al-Idah, before you study any of these works, just understand the purpose behind mukhtasarat. And there's a big difference, ahbab, in writing a primer initially for students in order to grant them ta'sil in al-ilm versus taking a mutawwal work and trying to do ikhtisar of it. When you're taking something very large and what matters is the exact amount of pages you have, and you're trying to do shadid ikhtisar of it, what you do in the process is that you will take a bunch of things and just remove them all together because you feel they're not the most important thing that needs to be mentioned. Wadih? Okay. If I'm trying to grant a student ta'sil in an ilm, like you're trying to develop a foundation in an ilm, then this process of ikhtisar can at times be very, very problematic. So over here we would say the ikhtisar, for example, could be mukhil, it could be mu'aqqad, it could be very difficult to open it up. When you hear teachers going like, this matan, for example, requires fakkul ibara. Like Jalalain, for example. Take Jalalain, for example. Why is Jalalain taught, like it's taught number one in the second to last year, so in the year of Mishkat, in the majority of the madaris. Why is it taught so late? Why are they teaching Jalalain so late? Why not teach it earlier? It seems like very mukhtasar. Like, no. If you want to learn Jalalain properly and you really want to understand the isharat that Suyuti or Mahalli is making in their work, okay, they're mentioning 1-2 words and they're giving isharat to entire mabahith nahwiyya, entire discussions of nahwa. Of course, they're not going to tell you all of that. That's the point. It's a mukhtasar. Okay, so let's say, for example, in the i'rab of the verse, there's actually 2 opinions. There's 2 opinions regarding the i'rab of the verse. Okay, there's different ways to do it. And al-i'rabu bin niyat, as you know in nahwa, al-i'rabu bin niyat. So instead of mentioning both opinions and then mentioning the pros and cons of both opinions and who held this opinion, who held that opinion, and showing you how it differs and how it will influence the meaning and so on and so forth, they will just add 1 word after the verse, after the word in the verse, just to show you the opinion they gave tarjih to, and they just move on. And sometimes you're looking like, okay, he's just saying the same thing. What's the whole point of this? Does that make sense, ahbab? So unless you understand nahwa to that level and you understand i'rab to that degree, where you already understood automatically that, okay, there actually could be multiple opinions in this verse regarding the i'rab of this verse, and then you get why he mentioned that verse to give ishara towards you to what needs to be muqaddar in that situation, so you understand it. Aslan, ahbab, if you don't understand nahwa to the degree of kafiyah and these high level or good works in nahwa, or at least to a strong degree, you understand how to do i'rab properly and so on and so forth, you have half the Jalalain, you're not going to understand what he's trying to do. So these works, they are usually, there's subtle isharat that they're giving in these works. And again, these scholars that compiled these works, these mukhtasarat, they were not normal scholars. A lot of them were very strong scholars, geniuses. And so in that process of ikhtisar, They naturally want to give you an ishara towards something greater, but because they're trying to make it as concise as possible, they're not elaborating on it. Does this make sense, Ahbab? This is a very, very important concept. You're going to take this, not only apply to Uṣūl al-Shāshī, you have to apply it to every single mukhtasar that you come across. This is the beauty of mukhtasarat, and at the same time, it's the problem with mukhtasarat. Okay, Ahbab? It's the beauty of them, it's also the problem with it. Why? It's beautiful because you have such a small book, yet it can, like, if you really want to dive into it, you're able to infer, and it implies such great ma'ani behind the words that it's using. That's the beauty of it. What is the problem with it? The problem is if you are trying to use these mukhtasarat to gain ta'sil in an ilm, to gain a foundation in an ilm, then they are very, very, I would say not suitable to grant that ta'sil, to grant that foundation in the ilm. Okay, when we study, like for example, when you study am and khas, let's just go into the actual work so you see what I'm saying. Okay. Now, let's just look at the discussion regarding am. Now, so when he says وَأَمَّا الْعَامْ فَنَوْعَانْ عَامٌ خُصَّ عَنْهُ الْبَعْض وَعَامٌ لَمْ يُخَصَّ عَنْهُ شَيْءٍ. He mentions two types of am. This is in terms of the hukum. The hukum, right? What is the hukum of am? How do we treat am? Like, before this is an entire discussion. Before we even get here, first thing we have to do is when we talk about the ta'rif of khas and am, okay, the author over here, he says لفظ وضع لمعنى معلوم أو لمسمى معلوم على الانفراد. Like, he only gave you one definition. He didn't tell you, okay, there's 5-6 definitions that you can possibly assume of this, and throughout these 5 definitions, 6 definitions, I chose this one. Like, what's the difference between ma'na? What's the difference between musamma? Why did I mention these two? Because again, these muhtarazat, these quyud and definitions, they're not mentioned hakada, yani, for the sake of it. They're very precise definitions that they're choosing. طيب. And then he says كقولنا في تخصيص الفرد زيد وفي تخصيص النوع رجل وفي تخصيص الجنس إنسان. He doesn't define for you fard, he doesn't define for you no, he doesn't define for you jins. He doesn't tell you that, okay, according to the usuliyun, fard, no, and jins are not the same as according to the manatiqa. When manatiqa say jins and no, they intend something else. The usuliyun intend something else. And we're intending the usuli understanding, not the mantiqi understanding. Doesn't explain all of that. Just gives you basic example. If you get it, you get it. If you don't get it, la bas. We're trying to make it as mukhtasar as possible. Then al-am, same thing. He tells you am kullu lafdhin yantazimu jam'a min al-afrad. He says this could be lafdhan, it could also be ma'na, but then he doesn't give you the sigh of umum. Like, if you're, how do you recognize a word which is am when you see it? Like, just skip it all together. Okay, so the sigh of umum are not mentioned. Then that in reality, there are some scholars that do tawaqquf in am for a very specific reason. They don't even follow through with the hukum regarding it. He doesn't mention the hukum of am as well. Okay, there's some scholars that, so there's difference regarding the ahkam of am. None of that is mentioned, and he goes straight to the two types of am according to the Hanafiya, because this is what matters according to the Hanafi in the end, right? And the hukum, and then he goes straight to examples. Like, الآن, أحباب, this is what happens when you have شديد مختصرات. The majority of what is required in ta'sil, if a student is using these mukhtasarat in order to attain ta'sil in an ilm, ta'sil meaning a foundation, meaning it's for the very first time that they're studying it, what is necessary in order to gain ta'sil in the ilm is actually skipped in a mukhtasar. Because in the mukhtasar, they want to give you the most important point, and they want to give you the most, sometimes even controversial point, to show you what they think is right in that controversial stance, or in that controversial discussion. And they don't want to elaborate on all of the extra stuff, which sometimes, to their credit, they might actually feel that the student will understand it anyways, because it's just common sense in their time. The level of knowledge was at that level. Today, what is one of the biggest downfalls of studying usul in this method specifically, and it goes to fiqh and every single ilm for that matter, but specifically usul, is that if you don't even develop a proper tasawwur of the mas'ala, then forget it. Everything else is pointless. Learning all of this extra stuff after that is completely pointless. You need to first develop the correct tasawwur of the mas'ala. After you understand how the mas'ala actually works, meaning you truly understand what does it mean when something is mutlaq, what does it mean when something is muqayyid, you're able to recognize it, you're able to experience it, you're able to, you yourself, when you open the Quran, you're able to recognize it when you see it. Only after that can we go into these nuances and these discussions, and then potentially start giving you examples that are contested, and potentially start giving you examples of other things completely, just to show you that, okay, we're going to treat this just like that and the same hukum is going to be applied. Only then we go all over the place to all those other discussions. The first thing we have to do is at least develop correct tasawwur of the mas'ala. At least understand what mutlaq is, what muqayyad is. When you see it, you recognize it. You experience it. It's not just, random words and you have no idea what they mean. When you open a mushaf, when you open the Quran, you go on a random page, you're able to determine, that's mutlaq, that's muqayyad, that's mutlaq, that's muqayyad. You're able to see it directly. Then you're able to understand, okay, if I tell you that mutlaq is treated in a certain way, muqayyad is treated in a certain way, you're able to understand the implications of that automatically, before going into all of the places where we differ with the Shafi'iyya or where there's difference amongst the fuqaha. Then after that, you understand, okay, wait, there's difference amongst the fuqaha in certain scenarios. Why is there difference? What are the evidences that they're using? What are the evidences that these individuals are using? Does this make sense, ahbab? So for the tasawwur of the mas'ala, for the ta'sil, if you're using these works in order to grant you ta'sil, the first thing that is required is tasawwur of the mas'ala, correct tasawwur. If you don't have correct tasawwur, you will never understand. You will never understand what is really being intended. Okay, now what's the problem? And let's say we have this work which is Uṣūl al-Shāshī, and we understand that it is a mukhtasar. It is a mukhtasar, which means that it's compiled in a very specific method for a very specific purpose. And what we can do is that, let's say this is not good for the beginner level students, because it's not good, it's not able to give them ta'sil, and we want to create within them ta'sil and a foundation, and this is not easy to be able to produce that. Now, let's say this is the process that we want to take. And what if we compiled another work, and through that we tried to grant ta'sil, and then we went to Uṣūl al-Shāshī? Now this makes sense. This is smarter. A work like the pre-Uṣūl al-Shāshī, which is just for the purpose of ta'sil. However, ahbab, when we compile that work, the point is that what we want to do and achieve by way of that work is all of the problems that are in Uṣūl al-Shāshī. We want to fix that, meaning in the sense that there are problems with Uṣūl al-Shāshī, but there are problems with if a student wants to gain ta'sil by way of Uṣūl al-Shāshī. Understand the point over here. I'm not trying to say the book has a problem. I'm trying to say that the author had a very specific gharad when he was compiling the work. And if you don't study through that gharad, you're going to misunderstand or you're going to misstudy the work. All of this, inshallah ta'ala, ahbab, when we study the work, you're going to understand all of this, inshallah ta'ala. All of these examples, everything that I'm saying right now might be ambiguous statements. But inshallah, when we actually go through the work, you're going to understand exactly what I mean. Al-an, what we can do is that let's create a work which is pre-Uṣūl al-Shāshī, in which we can grant that ta'sil, so that when we go to Uṣūl al-Shāshī, we can focus more on what the author was trying to focus on. We can focus more on what the author was trying to focus on. That would be perfect. What's the thing that we shouldn't do, though? If you were going to compile a work before Uṣūl al-Shāshī so that it can fulfill this task, okay, then one thing that we need to be careful of is that if you just took Uṣūl al-Shāshī and just further made it a mukhtasar, right, just took the same work, Uṣūl al-Shāshī, and just further minus and subtracted whatever he mentioned to make it even more smaller. Yes, you made it smaller, but you didn't fix the problem. So, for example, in Mabadi al-Uṣūl, the idea behind Mabadi al-Uṣūl was that before Uṣūl al-Shāshī, let's have a more simpler version. In that, just remove a bunch of stuff that was in Uṣūl al-Shāshī that might be extra things, to make it easier so students can memorize it. Now, this is good. If you just memorize, if you learn Mabadi al-Uṣūl for the sake of just pure memorization and nothing else, that's actually something which is very good. You're memorizing the terms. But in terms of fahm, in terms of comprehension, in terms of assisting the student in comprehending the tariqah of the Uṣūliyyin, that is something which doesn't happen whatsoever through Mabadi al-Uṣūl. Why? Because the same issues that would be over here are going to also be applied, also going to be found over there. So now when students are studying Mabadi al-Uṣūl, trying to comprehend Usul using Mabadi al-Uṣūl, the same issue is going to happen over there. So this is why you end up having, in a lot of our madaris, a lot of our institutions, students go through Usul al-Fiqh and they never actually understand, or they feel like they're never actually grasping what actually is being said. These ulum, the ulum, like for example, Usul al-Fiqh, Usul al-Hadith, these are ma'qulat. Ma'qulat means these are ulum aqliya, they're rational sciences. And these rational sciences require comprehension and not memorization. Yes, after you comprehend, you memorize. So you couple the comprehension with memorization after you comprehend. You cannot memorize at the expense of comprehension. Comprehension is everything. The entire ilm will not be understood unless you comprehend the actual mas'ala, the way the author is intending to relay that mas'ala. So this is something very, very important that we have to keep in mind and consider as we are studying this work. طيب. Going on, we say يوجد تعقيد ما في بعض المسائل. Now again, this is a byproduct of making it a mukhtasar, which is that in some masail, it is the mas'ala itself is presented in a very ambiguous manner and not necessarily it's not elaborated completely. واضح. طيب الآن there's no issue with that from the musannif's perspective, because again he was intended to compile a mukhtasar. The issue is from the student's perspective. If you're going to use this work to try and gain ta'sil, again you're going to come across this obstacle and it's going to be difficult for you. طيب. Then we say أخر مبحث الأمر عن مبحث الخاص. طيب. أمر is actually from the مباحث of خاص. In Uṣūl al-Shāshī he didn't mention it in the مباحث of خاص, as is mentioned in Manar al-Anwar and before that al-Bazdawi and other works as well. They mention Amr as soon as they mention Khas. They mention Khas, then they mention Amr, because Amr and Nahi are most important components of Khas. And they go into the entire discussion regarding Amr and Nahi in the middle of Khas. They don't give it a separate bab altogether. طيب. Sahib Usul al-Shāshī, in this work, he actually didn't mention Amr after Mabhath of Khas at all. He delayed it all the way till the end. And after he mentioned all of the wujuh arba'ah, when it comes to the Kitabullah, then he mentioned the Mabhath of Amr and Nahi. So it's literally in the second half of the book. اختصر مبحث القياس. Now, this is really important as well. In Usul al-Shāshī, the discussion regarding qiyas is extremely mukhtasar. In fact, it's so mukhtasar that as if qiyas is not even being taught in the work to its fullest extent. Inshallah, when you go through it, you'll see this, inshallah ta'ala. And again, the purpose of the author was اختصار شديد. You want to keep that in mind. لم يتعرض لمبحث العواد كعادة الحنفية في كتبهم في آخر كتبهم الأصولية. طيب, the Hanafiya in the end of their books of Usul, they mention awarid. This is a really beautiful masala to mabhath as well. This is not found in the books of Jumhur, it's only found in the books of Hanafiya. They mention in that there's awarid samawiyya and awarid kasbiyya. And يعني الذي يعرض الأهلية, it's the whole concept that is presented. It's mentioned at the end of Manar al-Anwar and the end of that whole entire, all the books that are following this Madrasa of Bazdawi and Saraqsi. It's not mentioned at the end of Usul al-Shāshī. So, wallahu a'lam, what I'm understanding from this is that in the beginning the author was a bit more careful of how his ikhtisar was happening. Towards the end he just wanted the book to finish. Like he quickly finished it off. He didn't want to prolong it. So it is an entire mabhath he just subtracted altogether. Like entire mabhath of awarid is just subtracted. It's not mentioned at all. And this is the entire discussion. Like awarid are divided into two categories. Both categories divided into a nice 9-10 categories, and each one of them have discussions in them. So just subtracting the entire thing altogether, that is what we find in this work. طيب, ذكر ما يفعل المجتهد عند تعارض الدليلين بالاختصار. This is interesting. Normally the مبحث of تعارض is also mentioned استقلالا. And you mention when it's تعارض بين الأدلة, what do we do? That is mentioned as a separate مبحث altogether. طيب, that's what we mentioned in the Ḥanafī Uṣūl 101. The level 1 that we previously went through. Over here he doesn't mention this as a mabhath, separate mabhath. It's just in the middle, randomly he adds one two lines that he gives an ishara towards and he moves on. طيب, يستطرد أحيانا بعد ذكر الأمثلة إلى مسائل جانبية لا علاقة لها بالقاعدة الأصولية. Now, this is really important, really, really important. When he mentions the furu', right? So one thing that he does often is that he tries to mention furu' from masail, which is really interesting. There's benefit to this, and a lot of benefit if you approach it the way that it's meant to be approached. Sometimes what the author will do though is that from that he will do istitrad. Istitrad, yani he goes off into another tangent. And what he's trying to do to you is he's trying to give you another ishara towards something else, because he might have mentioned something in his far' or in his example that might have made you question or think regarding something else. So he took you randomly into another tangent, and he'll give you a little ishara towards that as well. This happens as well, inshallah. When it comes, you will see. ينتقي من الأمثلة ما قد يشير إلى مسائل تركها لغرض الاختصار. نعم. From the examples that he mentions, he selectively chooses examples that can possibly give you ishara towards a mas'ala, an entire mas'ala that he chose to leave out for the purpose of ikhtisar. But he gives you ishara to it through the example that he chose. واضح. يذكر الدليل للقاعدة الأصولية أحيانا كما في بعض مباحث الأمر. This is very uncommon. However, sometimes he will mention the dalil for the قاعدة الأصولية as well. This is a basic manhaj of the author. Inshallah, tomorrow we'll talk about how a student can maximize the study of Usul al-Shāshī بإذن الله تعالى. We'll continue that with the next lesson. والحمد لله رب العالمين.